Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is David Cameron, a professor of political science and the director of the Yale program in EU Studies, who has written extensively about the Eurozone debt crisis. Today, we'll talk with him about Greece and the latest Eurozone crisis. Welcome, Professor Cameron.
Thank you.
So, just a month ago in January, a new Prime Minister of Greece was elected, Alexis Tsipras, and he, upon, I guess, widespread support, basically due to the austerity measures that Greece has been, drowning under since they were implemented as a part of the 240 billion euro bailout, has decided to undo the austerity measures and numerous other things. So basically, where are we today with that?
Well, we are today actually, not you and I personally, but the EU is meeting in Brussels, the Eurogroup, the 19 ministers of finance of the Eurozone member states are meeting and hearing from Yanis Varoufakis, who is the new Minister of Finance in the Syriza government in Greece. And Greece has been invited to present its plans and proposals for the future.
To be a fly on that wall.
Yeah, it would be great to be there. And tomorrow, the leaders, the heads of state and government, will be meeting in the European Council on a number of issues, but one of them being Greece. And then on Monday, the Eurogroup will meet again to deal with Greece. The background on this is, as you know, as you mentioned, there have been two bailouts in 2010, 2012, total of 240 billion, and 5 years of austerity accompanying the bailouts. And Syriza ran and campaigned against the austerity program, against the Troika, the three institutions, IMF, European Central Bank, and the EU, coming and monitoring their finances, against the pile of debt that they have. Tsipras proposed a 50% write-off or haircut for the official lenders. So there was a very radical program put on the table in the election campaign, which was great, got them 36% of the vote, not a majority, notice, but 36%. Now,
and do you have any ideas why it wouldn't be higher? I mean, because the people, the citizens were struggling.
Well, that's right. That's a good point. This is a hard left. It's a coalition of the radical left. It's a hard left government.
But I hear that the right, the conservative right, is also supporting this now, too.
There's a neo-fascist party, Golden Dawn, on the right, and there's a small right-wing party that is actually supporting the government because Syriza didn't get a majority. Even with the bonus that they got as the largest party, they didn't have a majority, but a right-wing party that is also against the austerity program and the bailout program came in and formed a coalition. So they have a peculiar hard left, right coalition, and they have a bare majority. They have just a few seats over the majority. So they are now coming into Europe to say, here's our concern, these are our issues. Now the problem they face is this, that they were in the bailout at the end of the bailout last fall, and there was a dispute between the Greek government of the time and the Troika over the projected growth plans and the budget deficit for this coming year. And the Troika had to approve that budget and the growth estimates on which it was based in order for Greece to get the last 2 billion of the bailout. They couldn't agree on that, and so in December, Greece received a 2-month extension through February 28th.
Okay.
So after that, At that point, the bailout ends, terminates. The real problem for Greece is that it's going to run out of money if there isn't some kind of extension of assistance beyond February 28th.
And if it runs out of money, then what happens?
If it runs out of money, the real problem is that in addition to being able to cover its expenses and just pay for the operation of the government, Greece owes $15 billion this year, $8 billion to the IMF, and another $7 billion on top of that to the ECB. So they owe $15 billion on the debt, and they can't possibly pay that off without assistance. So everyone has known for a long time they need help, and they will run out of money. If they run out of money, then they would default on their debt.
And then what happens?
Well, even before that, what will happen is when people understand that they are running out of money, there will be a run on the banks. The banks will collapse.
Big mess.
There'll be capital flight, and Greece will be in a situation where it will have to, in worst case scenario, default on the debt and leave the Eurozone. Now that's a worst case scenario, but that's what will happen if they don't reach an agreement. So everyone understands they have to come to some kind of agreement.
So both sides,
both
including
sides.
Cyprus.
Cyprus, and he's made a round of travel with all the meeting with all the leaders. And
my understanding, though, is in his meeting with Germany has already said, we're not buying what you're selling.
Well, Germany's not going to buy what they're selling, because what Greece wants to do is not extend the bailout. That would be very difficult for them to do that politically, to go back to Athens and say, well, by the way, we've changed our mind and we're continuing the bailout and we're going to accept the conditions and we'll continue with the austerity. They don't want to do that.
Right.
So what they want to do is get a new loan, a bridge loan, that would have conditions that wouldn't be as onerous as in the bailout. And then they want to negotiate, and they want that bridge loan to cover them for up to 6 months through the end of August, and then negotiate a longer term agreement, a new deal, as they call it, that would provide them assistance for a longer term, where again there wouldn't be the onerous conditions and the austerity. They could do more of what they want to do in government, which for Syriza, not surprisingly, means increasing public employment, increasing wages, increasing the pensions that were cut, dealing with the unemployment issues, which are still huge.
25% roughly, right?
25% of the population of the workforce, but more than 50% of those under 25. So huge problem, continuing. So they want to do that.
Let me ask you, do the EU leaders and the IMF recognize that the austerity measures did not work? Is anyone saying that, or you know?
They know that. They know that privately. They won't say that publicly, but they know that privately. But they will blame Greece, and they blame the government for not implementing a number of measures in advance. They also, if you ask them, will say Greece never should have come in the Eurozone to begin with. They fabricated. That's a
little bit too late now.
They fabricated their qualifying data, and back in 2001, you know, the problem now is we have a country that is sitting with a mountain of debt, $325 billion. 75% of which is owed to the official lenders, meaning IMF, EU, ECB, and servicing that debt is going to be very difficult. And in fact, the debt payments that are due in 2015, in this year, exceed by a large amount the amount that is due in any other year between now and 2030. So there's a short-term immediate problem. Now, I mentioned already what Greece wants, which is a bridge loan no austerity attached to it, and then a negotiation for a longer-term deal. What the EU wants is to extend the bailout, in other words, continue the conditions, by doing what they call a technical extension, which they would change the language a little bit, and they would basically extend it, but they would continue the conditions. And then they'd talk later about whether there would be a deal. And I think it's pretty clear that sooner or later there will be some kind of arrangement to deal with the short-term problem of financial assistance to keep Greece going. Some of the conditions will be modified probably. And there are all kinds of ways the two sides can fiddle with the details in these agreements so that it will be hard for anyone to understand how much Greece is backed away from what they originally wanted and how much the EU got of what it wanted, which is pretty much continuing the same austerity conditions. So there'll be something on the order of either a technical extension or a bridge loan. It will not be called a program. It won't be called austerity. Those words are toxic in Greece. You can't use those. It will be a contract, a new deal, an arrangement, something that will give them enough money to get through March, where they have $4 billion due, and on through the summer when they have some debt payments due to the ECB. And then they have to deal with, longer term, they have to deal with this debt. They have to figure some way to deal with the debt. And
how can you possibly dig out from that much debt?
Well, what they proposed in the campaign was a 50% write-off of the debt. Just saying, okay,
we're just not going to pay back 50.
We borrowed 240, we owe you 120.
Right.
50% write-off.
So I don't think anyone's going to buy that, do you?
No one's going to buy that.
Right.
No one in Europe is going to buy that. The IMF won't buy that. And it was great for getting votes, but it's not going to happen. And Greece understands that.
They do?
Yeah, Greece actually does understand that.
Okay.
And the Minister of Finance, who's a very attractive, charismatic guy who has made the rounds of all of the capitals in the last week, has put forward a variety of plans that would involve alternative ways of stretching out the debt, for example, rescheduling it, stretching out the maturities into the future. In fact, one plan he's proposed is that they would be swapped into perpetual bonds, which means there's no maturity. It just goes on forever. There are other instruments he's proposed, such as growth-based bonding, which would involve calibrating the amount you pay to your growth rate, so that if you're doing well, you can pay back some money. If you're not doing well and you're in a recession, contraction, you don't pay back.
Now, let me ask you this. I had said
the
earlier
EU probably won't buy
that
any
Germany
of that.
in particular has already said we're not interested in any of those plans.
Right.
Wolfgang, I mean, is it true that he basically
Schäuble
is running the leadership in terms of this situation?
Well, Wolfgang Schäuble is a very interesting figure. He's the finance minister. He's a former head of the CDU, so he's a powerful politician in Germany. He's a close ally of Merkel. And he really, he doesn't run the EU in monetary policy, but he's a hard-nosed person, and he's good at saying no.
Right. And I think the other countries look to him.
And they do.
You think?
Yeah,
yes.
Everyone looks to him because he's smart, and he knew probably earlier than anyone else in 2010 that the real problem in Europe, in the EMU, was that they didn't have a fiscal policy, they didn't have an economic policy or union. All they had was a monetary union. And there was a real institutional problem in the design and the architecture of EMU. And he acknowledged that and recognized that probably sooner than anyone else. But he and Christine Lagarde, who at the time was the Minister of Finance in France and is now the managing director of the IMF, were really the two people who were running you might say, running EMU when they were dealing with the bailouts in those first years. So he's very tough, but he's not the only one. The Dutch finance minister is now the head of the Eurogroup, and he's had some very, you might say, chilly conversations with the Greek finance minister. The Finns are very tough. So there are a number of countries in Northern Europe that see the Southern Europeans, and Greece in particular, as having flouted the rules and norms and guidelines of EMU, and they're not about to give them a free pass. So it will be a hard negotiation. And the interesting thing about it is there is a path for a compromise and a middle ground in this.
What is it?
Well, it would be, whether you call it a technical extension or bridge loan, whatever, or come up with some new name that neither side has actually used, as a way to get them some money for about 6 months while you negotiate a longer-term package. And that will look like a victory. We solved this crisis that looked like it might lead to a Greek exit, which is good. There's no more of that tough austerity on Greece, which is good. You know, the EU might really develop an employment program for Greece, all kinds of things that they could do. So there's a way they could carve a middle ground.
So do you think that's the way it will go?
I think that's the way it will go. But the key, the secret in this is, of course, all of the parties have to be able to go back to their local constituencies and say, we did well, we got what we wanted. You know, Cyprus has to be able to go back to the Athens parliament, the parliament in Athens, and say, we got what we wanted, we were responsible, we told them we wanted to stay in the Eurozone, but we insisted on our conditions and we got it, and they'll get something which may be symbolic. The Germans have a tough constituency there. I mean, Schäuble, the finance minister, has to go to the Bundestag, and Merkel has to go to the Bundestag and explain what they did and how they handled this. So all of the parties have to be able to go back to their constituencies and say, we did it. And how you craft something so that everyone can claim a victory and make
Diplomacy at its finest.
It has to be win-win. It has to be win-win, and in fact, it won't be win-win. It'll be both sides giving something and finding a middle ground.
Sure.
But, so I think that's what will happen.
And so if the compromise route is taken, what do you, Cyprus has really been pushing for the humanitarian relief for his country. How do you think the compromise will aid in his efforts around that?
Well, I think everyone in Europe understands that Greece has been through 5 years that, taken together, amount to a depression. They've been in an economic depression. I mean, 5 years of negative growth. They're finally beginning to come out, but they still have a very high rate of unemployment. And what they really need is some loosening of their spending. I mean, people have suffered enormously in terms of even people with pensions. The pensions have been reduced. Organized labor hasn't been able to organize and arrange their collective bargaining in the way they used to. Wages have been cut. There's a lot that needs to be done just from a humanitarian point of view. Raising the minimum wage. Improving the health care, improving some of the services that have been cut. And the EU, in my opinion, should do that and should let them get away from this silly, absolutely arbitrary notion that somehow they have to keep their budget deficit under 3% of GDP, which is absolutely ridiculous. No economist in the world can explain why 2.9% deficit is good and 3.1 deficit is bad. It's an entirely arbitrary figure that has been a mantra among the EU officials for a long time. They've got to relax on that and let Greece try to rebuild its economy and expand. And I think the same applies to the other countries of Southern Europe as well. France and Italy, for example, as well as Portugal. Spain is doing much better, surprisingly well, actually, right now.
Oh, that's good.
But in part because they took a lot of the tough medicine, but also made a number of major labor market reforms. But Greece really does need some help. It's under this mountain of debt. It can't possibly pay it off, and the people are suffering. And when you have an unemployment rate of 50% among young people, and there's so many young people who've dropped out of the labor market because they know they can't get jobs anyway, so they don't even count in that statistic. You know, it's really a difficult situation.
Very difficult. So hopefully compromise will be the way to go, and Greece will remain a part of the Eurozone.
Greece will remain. Cyprus has made it clear that Greece will stay in, and Varoufakis made it very clear this morning, in fact, in Brussels. He unambiguously made it clear that Greece is absolutely going to stay in the Eurozone, and they will. But and obviously, if they weren't going to stay, whatever bargaining power they have, which is not a great deal, would evaporate.
Sure.
So they're going to stay, but it will be a long, protracted negotiation. It won't be done this week or this weekend. It'll stretch out over months.
Okay.
People will get used to this negotiation going on, and at the end of the negotiation, they'll probably find some way to deal with it, and in a way that allows Cyprus to claim that he's delivered on his campaign promises, at least to some degree.
Good. Well, let's hope that happens, David.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here and keeping us up to date on the Eurozone.
Okay. Thank you. You're welcome.
Sure.
Yeah.
For more information about Professor Cameron and his research, please visit our website at yale.edu/MacMillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.